Welcome to the Good Book Tales. In today's video, we step into one of the most haunting chapters of ancient history, the never-told story of Jeremiah. Why did he cry before the invasion of Babylon? Imagine standing on a hill overlooking a city you love, a city that once echoed with laughter, the sound of children playing, and the prayers of faithful hearts. Now smoke rises from its edges, soldiers march in the distance, and the air trembles with the sound of fear. In that moment, a man stands alone, his eyes wet, his voice trembling as he warns of a disaster no one believes is coming. That man is Jeremiah. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a king. He was a prophet, a messenger who carried words too heavy for his heart. Long before the Babylonian army appeared, Jeremiah had already seen it all in visions. He had pleaded, cried, and begged his people to listen. But his warnings were met with laughter, mockery, and rejection. They called him the weeping prophet, not because he was weak, but because he cared too deeply. The story of Jeremiah is not just a story about ancient Jerusalem. It's a story about us. It's about what happens when truth is spoken and ignored, when love turns into loss, and when faith is tested by fire. Before the Babylonian invasion, Jeremiah walked the streets of Jerusalem, watching his people dance between hope and destruction. Every prophecy he spoke tore a piece from his heart. Every tear he shed was for a people he knew were walking into their own ruin. But what did Jeremiah really see? What made him weep before Babylon's armies even arrived? Was it simply fear of destruction? Or was it something far deeper? Something spiritual? Something the world was not ready to hear? In this episode, we'll uncover the hidden story behind Jeremiah's tears. We'll look beyond the ruins, into the man's soul, into the visions that shook him, the prayers that broke him, and the silence that followed his warnings. You'll see Jeremiah not just as a prophet, but as a human being, torn between obedience to God and compassion for his people. As the shadow of Babylon grew larger, Jeremiah faced the hardest truth of all, that sometimes even the messenger cannot stop the message from being fulfilled. And just as the walls of Jerusalem began to crack, something in Jeremiah's spirit shattered too. But before the first gate fell, before the city turned to ash, Jeremiah saw something that no one else did. Something that made him cry, not for what was coming, but for what was already lost. Stay with me, because what Jeremiah saw will change the way you see prophecy forever. Jeremiah's story begins long before the fires of Babylon touched the walls of Jerusalem. He was just a young man when he first heard the voice that would change his life forever. It wasn't loud or thunderous. It was quiet, yet it carried a weight that shook his soul. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you," the voice said. In that moment, Jeremiah understood that his life wasn't going to be ordinary. He was chosen, not for greatness, but for a burden that would test every part of his being. In those early days, Jerusalem was still full of life. The markets were busy, priests filled the temple, and kings sat on their thrones, believing their walls would protect them forever. But Jeremiah could already sense a crack in the spirit of his people. They had grown proud, distant, and careless. The sacred songs were still sung, but their hearts were far from the words. Deep inside, Jeremiah knew that something was breaking. Not just the covenant between God and his people, but their understanding of what it meant to be faithful. When Jeremiah began to speak, few listened. Some pitied him, others mocked him. "The prophet of doom," they whispered, as he stood in the temple courts pleading for repentance. But his words weren't born from anger. They came from love. A desperate love for a nation that had lost its way. Every time he warned of the coming invasion of Babylon, his voice trembled not because he was afraid, but because he could already see what others refused to see. He saw mothers searching for their children. He saw the temple gates torn apart. He saw a silence falling over Jerusalem that even prayer couldn't break. Still, Jeremiah didn't stop. He walked the streets, spoke to kings, and prayed through the night. He told them Babylon was rising, not just as an enemy, but as a sign that something sacred had been broken. The people laughed. The leaders silenced him. Even his friends turned away. Yet he continued, because something inside him knew that truth, even when unwelcome, must still be spoken. As the years passed, the tension grew. Rumors of war filled the air, but the city continued its routine, blind to the storm that was forming beyond its walls. Jeremiah's tears became more frequent, his words more urgent, and somewhere deep within, he began to realize that the invasion of Babylon wasn't just the fall of a city. It was the breaking of a promise, one he would be forced to watch unfold. What Jeremiah didn't know yet was that his greatest vision, the one that would reveal why he truly wept, was still waiting for him. The conflict inside Jeremiah grew stronger with every passing day. He loved his people deeply, yet he was the one sent to deliver the message they feared most. It tore him apart. Each prophecy felt like a wound that would not heal. When he spoke of Babylon's invasion, he could see disbelief in their eyes, the kind that hurts more than open rejection. The kings still trusted their alliances, the priests still performed their rituals, and the merchants still traded in the streets as if nothing could ever change. But Jeremiah saw the signs in everything: the silence before the storm, the weight in the air, the unease that crept through the city when night fell. In his loneliness, Jeremiah often turned to prayer. There were nights when he cried out under the stars, asking why he had been chosen for such a painful mission. Sometimes he felt God's presence close, like a whisper of comfort. Other times, there was only silence, a silence heavier than any word. Yet even in that silence he couldn't turn away. His heart would not let him. He knew that truth, no matter how harsh, was still a form of mercy. Among the people, whispers began to spread. Some said Jeremiah was cursed. Others thought he was secretly working with Babylon. The leaders accused him of weakening the city's spirit with fear. He was beaten, imprisoned, and left in darkness, but even there, his voice would not break. He spoke of repentance, of returning to faith before it was too late. But his pleas echoed through empty halls. Outside the city, Babylon's shadow was growing larger. The rumors of their armies moving closer became harder to ignore. And as the first flames of war touched the horizon, Jeremiah knew that the real battle was no longer outside the walls. It was within every heart, still beating inside Jerusalem. The night before Babylon reached the gates, the city felt different. The air was thick, heavy, almost trembling with a kind of fear no one could name. Jeremiah walked through the narrow streets, hearing the distant sound of soldiers sharpening their weapons, and families whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in years. The prophet's heart ached. Every step felt like walking through a dream he had seen long ago, one that was now coming to life before his eyes. The torches flickered against the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a horn sounded. Babylon was near. Inside the palace, the king's advisors argued through the night. Some demanded to fight. Others wanted to surrender. But no one spoke of what Jeremiah had warned, that this was not just a war of nations, but a reckoning. Outside, people gathered at the temple, crying out for mercy, their voices breaking through the silence. Yet even in their prayers, Jeremiah could sense that few truly understood what was happening. It wasn't only the city that was collapsing. It was the heart of a people who had turned away for too long. Jeremiah stood near the temple gates, his robe torn, his eyes red from sleeplessness. He could hear the rumble of Babylon's chariots in the distance, the ground trembling beneath his feet. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and a vision flashed before him. flames rising, the sacred walls falling, and the sound of weeping that filled the heavens. He felt both the weight of judgment and the ache of compassion. This was the moment he had dreaded, the moment he had tried to prevent with every tear and every word. And as the first light of dawn touched the sky, Jeremiah saw the shadow of Babylon stretch across the land. And he knew that everything was about to change forever. As the shadow of Babylon spread across the hills, something unexpected happened inside Jerusalem. Instead of turning to repentance, the city turned to rebellion. The king, desperate to hold power, rejected Jeremiah's final plea and threw him into an empty cistern, a pit of mud and darkness. The prophet, who had once walked freely through the temple courts, now found himself trapped below the earth, his voice silenced by fear and stone walls. Yet even there, Jeremiah could feel the trembling of the ground above him, the echo of marching soldiers drawing closer with each heartbeat. In the dim light, Jeremiah whispered prayers, not for himself, but for his people. And it was in that silence, in that place of despair, that he received another vision, one that shook him more deeply than all the others before it. He saw not only the fall of Jerusalem, but something beyond it, the exile, the scattering, and the faint light of hope flickering in the distance. It was as if God was showing him that destruction was not the end, but the beginning of something he could not yet understand. Still, that knowledge didn't bring peace. It made the pain sharper, knowing that everything dear to him had to break before renewal could come. Meanwhile, above ground, chaos had taken hold. Families tried to flee the city, priests clung to the temple doors, and soldiers shouted orders no one could follow. Smoke began to rise from the outer gates, and in the midst of that confusion, a small group of Jeremiah's followers, loyal and desperate, risked their lives to pull him out of the pit. When he stepped into the light again, his face was pale, his body weak, but his spirit burned stronger than ever. He looked toward the horizon, where the sky glowed with the reflection of fire. For a brief moment he thought of running, escaping what was coming, but then the voice that had called him since his youth spoke again, calm, steady, certain. Jeremiah knew he couldn't flee. He had to stand and witness what he had spent his life warning about. And as the city walls began to quake under the weight of Babylon's advance, Jeremiah realized that the true battle was no longer between nations. It was between faith and fear, between holding on to hope or letting despair claim what was left of the human heart. The morning the Babylonians entered Jerusalem, the sky was a dull gray, as if the heavens themselves refused to look down on what was happening. Jeremiah stood at the edge of the temple courtyard, surrounded by smoke and chaos. The city that once glowed with golden light and the sound of songs was now filled with cries, the clash of iron, and the echo of breaking stone. Everything he had warned them about was happening right before his eyes. Yet there was no triumph in being right, only sorrow. The weeping prophet's heart felt like it was breaking in two. But then, in the midst of the destruction, something unexpected happened. As the temple burned and soldiers rushed through the streets, a young Babylonian guard stopped in front of Jeremiah. Unlike the others, his eyes were calm, almost searching. He called Jeremiah by name, not to harm him, but to protect him. Word had reached Babylon's commander that there was a man in the city who had spoken of this day long before it came. They believed he was a man of truth, a prophet who must be spared. It was a moment that silenced the noise around him. While others fled or fought, Jeremiah stood still, realizing that even in judgment, mercy could still be found. The same God who had allowed the city to fall had also preserved his messenger. Yet the twist of fate was painful. Jeremiah was saved, but his home, his people, and his temple were gone. He walked through the ruins as Babylon's army took control, his sandals crunching over ashes and shattered stone. Every corner of the city told a story of pride, loss, and promises forgotten. Then came the final twist, one Jeremiah had never expected. Among the captives led away in chains, he saw a familiar face, one of the very priests who had mocked him years before. Their eyes met, and in that moment there was no hatred, only understanding. The man bowed his head in silence, a quiet admission that Jeremiah had spoken the truth all along. As the dust settled and the fires dimmed, Jeremiah lifted his eyes to the horizon. He knew Babylon's victory was not the end. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a new story was waiting, one of return, of rebuilding, and of hope that could rise even from the ashes of Jerusalem. When the fires finally died and the last echoes of war faded into the hills, Jeremiah stood among the ruins of Jerusalem. The once lively city was silent now, a place of smoke, ashes, and broken dreams. Every street held a memory. The laughter of children, the songs of the temple, the sound of his own voice pleading for the people to listen. Now, there was only wind. Yet even in the quiet, Jeremiah felt that God had not left completely. Something in the air still whispered of promise, a faint reminder that even in ruin, life finds a way to begin again. Days turned into weeks. The Babylonians had taken many into captivity, but they left Jeremiah free. They saw him not as an enemy, but as a man of wisdom, a prophet who had spoken truth, even when it cost him everything. Yet freedom did not feel like victory. Jeremiah walked through the empty courtyards, speaking softly to the stones, remembering every warning, every tear. He realized that his mission had never been to prevent the fall. It had been to keep faith alive after it happened. His words were seeds meant to grow in the hearts of those who would one day return. Among the rubble, Jeremiah found a scroll he had once written, a message of hope he thought was lost forever. He read it again, his voice trembling. "I will bring you back to this place. I will give you a future and a hope." The words struck him differently now. They were not just a promise for the people, but for himself. He understood that God's plan had always been bigger than the pain, that Babylon's invasion was not the end of Israel's story, but the beginning of its rebuilding. As the sun set behind the broken walls, Jeremiah looked out over the land that had shaped his life. His tears had not been wasted. They were the beginning of healing, the cry of a heart that refused to stop believing. He turned away from the ruins, carrying the promise of restoration in his heart. The city had fallen, but faith had not. And though Jeremiah's voice would one day fade into history, his story, the story of the weeping prophet who never gave up, would live on, reminding the world that even in the darkest hour, hope still speaks.